Well, welcome to the Leadership Podcast at Christ Church. I'm Charles Kyker, your host. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to start off with a line from our leadership night here at Christ Church. I remember a quote from a monastery, and I think it fits our theme today as well as the text from Luke 18. The quote is this: "Everyone wants to be part of a revolution, but no one wants to do the dishes." We want to be a part of something big, something epic, something amazing. Yet we forget it's those daily disciplines that help to get us there. Well, Jesus is talking about that today in Luke 18, which is our one-year Bible reading. At Christ Church, we believe that disciples are not made in a day, but we do believe they're made daily, as John Maxwell likes to say. And Luke 18, beginning at verse 1, going to verse 10, it says, "One day Jesus told his disciples a story to show that they should always pray and never give up. There was a judge in a certain city," he said, "who neither feared God nor cared about people. A widow in that city came to him repeatedly, saying, 'Give me justice in this dispute with my enemy.' The judge ignored her for a while, but finally he said to himself, 'I don't fear God or care about people, but this woman is driving me crazy. I'm going to see that she gets justice, because she's wearing me out with her constant request.' And then the Lord said, 'Learn a lesson from this unjust judge. Even he rendered a just decision in the end. So don't you think God will surely give justice to his chosen people who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will grant justice to them quickly. But when the Son of Man returns, how many will he find on earth who have faith?" How many will he find on earth who have faith? I think that's a great question. So I ask you, the listener, the participant today in our podcast, are you considered a person of faith? Would people say that about you? Would people say, yes, she's a person of faith. He is a person of faith. And in fact, I think she's a great person of faith. How would they know? How do you and I exemplify that? There's a couple of things about this passage I don't want us to step over because I do think this question of Jesus, when the Son of Man returns, will he find faith, people of faith, people exercising faith? I think that's a great question. We're not going to lose that theme. But I think it's also important for us to actually live into that question, is to look at this judge. There's two things about it that were quite striking to me. Judges in ancient Palestine in that era that Jesus lived in were often appointed by persons who were appointed. In other words, Rome would appoint the governor or the leader of that community. And that's why Pontius Pilate wanted to keep peace during this time. And historians tell us that he had served a number of years. And Rome, of course, would allow him to serve as long as he kept the peace. And Rome wanted control. Rome wanted the taxes to come in. Rome didn't want violence and uprisings all the time. And so it was important that the procurator, it was important that the person in charge keep peace. And so you had to have judges, of course, to handle civil affairs and other things. And then Annas Caiaphas, who was the high priest, he had a long tenure as well. Dr. William Barclay talks about this duality, and Annas Caiaphas, of course, had a lot of influence as the high priest, And he and Pontius Pilate had to, of course, have kind of an understanding, if you will, to keep the peace. And they had boundaries in which they operated in. And so judges were appointed. So what that means is a judge didn't have to be what I would understand and what many of you may understand, didn't really have to be a bona fide leader. Now, a leader, a true leader, is a person of influence. Leadership, and John Maxwell's not original with this. I can't remember where he got this initial quote from, but leadership is influence. But John has said it so often, I think most of us just think, well, that's John Maxwell, but John did borrow that phrase from someone else once upon a time. But leadership is influence. Simply put, that's what leadership is. If you influence 2 or 3 people, you're a leader. If you're a mother or a father and you influence 1 or 2 or 3 children, you're a leader. People follow you. Now, if nobody follows you, then you're not a leader. So if you're taking a walk and nobody's following you, then you're just on a walk by yourself. Nobody's following you. Nobody wants to go with you. Well, this judge was one of those persons. And we know he was because he confessionally said what? I don't care about God. So we know he was godless. And I don't care about people. And so I would simply say, well, you're welcome to come to worship, but I definitely don't want you on my staff. Because if you don't love God and you don't love people, you're not going to be a strong leader in the life of the church or the synagogue or whatever the case may be. But especially if you don't value people, if you don't care about people, you're not going to lead folks very far. If you're going to be a leader, you have to care about people. Now, not everybody's warm and fuzzy. Not everybody's a big hugger. Not everybody's a big handshaker. And if that's not you personally, if you didn't grow up in a home or a situation where you hugged all the time, or that was not your environment, that's not your makeup, your personality makeup, that doesn't mean you can't lead. You can care for people in many different ways. You can just genuinely ask them how they're doing. You can genuinely try to do things that add value to their lives. And when you see that things are frustrating them or hurting them, you can try to make corrections or have conversations that work through those problems and those difficulties because you value them and you simply don't want them to falter. You don't want them to spin their wheels. You want them to move forward. And so there's many different ways you and I can care for people. But we must care if we're going to lead. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to simply begin to write down the names of the people that you influence. Just write those names down. Who do you oversee, or who do you influence, or who do you think in your weekly schedule that you impact, and begin to think about them, and even ask the question, how can I add value to that person's life? How can I add value to her life, to his life? And I would start at home. If you're married, how can I be a better spouse? If I'm a mom or a dad, how can I be a better parent? If you're a son or a daughter, how can I be an encourager even to my parent or my grandparent? And you begin to think about at home. Because what I've found is that if I'm not leading well at home, at least in some capacity, if I'm not investing in my marriage and trying to help invest in others around me, then it's going to be difficult for me to lead elsewhere. The other thing is if you're putting out multiple fires at home, multiple times, all the time, it drains you. It just drains you. And when it drains you to that point, you don't have enough energy to invest outside the home. And so there's that delicate balance where, and there are seasons. I think there are seasons in any of our lives where there's some challenges at home right now. And I want to pay some attention to that. There's a child that's going through some difficulty. There's whatever the case may be. The spouse is kind of in a rut emotionally, or maybe there's some anxiety or some depression they're working through. And you need to focus there for a while. But if you're constantly having to put fires out, multiple times a day maybe, or during the week, and you're constantly doing that, it can be quite draining on you to be able then to add value outside of the home. And some people just focus primarily at work or their vocation or their business or whatever, because they're really not good at anything at home. They don't feel valued at home, therefore they don't give value at home. And so they just kind of let home go, and they focus on the marketplace or their vocation or their profession. And they may be viewed in the community as a great success there, but there's nothing going on. There's no stability in the home. And then, of course, then eventually there's going to be a time of reckoning or accountability. So I think it's important to start at home and say, okay, how can I care for those around me? And try to balance that as best as possible. And then how can I care for those who I influence outside of the home? How can I invest in them, support them, encourage them, and sometimes just a listening ear, and just to value people. And then if you can somehow help them improve where they are, what they're doing, help them problem solve. We don't have to solve all the problems as leaders. We have to make sure that the problems are addressed, because a leader's greatest task is to define reality. Now, if you don't get anything out of the podcast today, you better write that one down. Leader's greatest task is to define reality. Where are we right now in this organization? Where are we right now in this team? And then how can we assess what's going on honestly, and then how can we move forward? And how can I help you with that? But if I go around solving all the problems in an organization, they're going to look at me as the chief problem solver, and then they're not going to solve any problems. And that's not the way to lead. You want to empower people to solve problems at their level where they are, but you also want to be a sounding board when they need that. John Ortberg, who was a very strong communicator for so many decades in the Christian world, often would talk about going in. He was one of the teaching pastors at Willow Creek, often going in to see the founding pastor at Willow, just to get ideas, just to get whatever. And especially when he was feeling like he had writer's block. And it's hard to imagine John Ortberg, if you're going to walk on water, you got to get out of the boat. Great sermon series, great book. He wrote several other wonderful books. He wrote, I believe it was 2010, Who Is This Man? An incredible study on the person of Jesus and how Jesus literally changed history. So it's hard to imagine John Ortberg having writer's block, but he did. It's hard for me to imagine Max Lucado having writer's block. But I think, truth be told, every leader needs somebody they can bounce ideas off of. So that's a good thing. That I'm not saying don't go to other people. We should. But I'm just saying at the end of the day, though, we need to solve problems as much as we can at the local level, but then still feel that we have access to our directional leaders or our managers or the CEO, or how your organization is structured. But I believe we got to add value to people, and you can do that even if you're not the warmest, fuzziest person out there. But you just have to be intentional about caring for folks, and we need to do that. We all need to do, I think, more of that, and especially our younger generation wants just time with leaders. And so I think that's important. So he was a godless man, and he said he didn't like people. And I'm like, my goodness. So why are you a judge? But maybe let's give him a little bit of benefit of the doubt. Maybe if he is a judge and he's seen so much meanness, spitefulness, and corruption, maybe he's just kind of had a hardened heart over a time. I've seen so much despicable behavior. I've seen so much infighting in families. I've seen so much injustice and injustice going on. I'm just starting not to like people because I see how awful they can be. So I understand some of that. And there are times, where you just feel overwhelmed with the problems that people might bring to you or they might be living in. At the same time, you got to be a steward of your post. And so I think it's important to reverse that. So I know parabole is to get along beside of. So Jesus was trying to tell a parable primarily with the truth in mind that we must be faithful and persistent over spiritual disciplines. We must be persistent in prayer. Don't give up, he said. Be persistent in prayer. That's primarily what Jesus is trying to communicate through this parable. But I also want to flip this judge's character around and ask the question, what if he feared God? What if, when he got up in the morning, his prayer was, God, above all else, I want to please you more than anything. Above all else, I want to love you and fear you. By fear, not to tremble at the thought that God was going to zap him, but by fearing God, I want to do what is right. I want to honor you. My greatest fear in life is to displease you. That's the fear of God. That, to me, that's a healthy fear. My greatest fear in life is that I would displease God, that I would embarrass God. And so wake up in the morning, your prayers, you want to fear God. You want to be faithful. The second thing, God help me to love people. God help me to love people. So let's flip this character default of the judge around and say, what if my heart was to fear God above all else, love God, please God? And then secondly, how can I love people and how can I add value to their life? How can I do that today, God? And I believe if you and I consistently seek to love God and love people, we'll start to be people of faith. Because faith, I believe, is simply trusting in God and valuing God. And so if I begin to value God and trust God, I start to walk in faith. And in our one-year Bible reading, if you want an image of a faithful person, let me introduce you to the first and foremost giant slayer. It's the 14th chapter of Joshua. It's verse 6. A delegation from the tribe of Judah led by Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Kizite, came to Joshua at Gilgal. Caleb said to Joshua, remember what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, about you and me when we were at Kadesh Barnea. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land of Canaan. I returned and gave an honest report, but my brothers who went with me frightened the people from entering the promised land. For my part, I wholeheartedly followed the Lord my God. So that day Moses solemnly promised me, the land of Canaan on which you were just walking will be your grant of land, and that your descendants forever, because you wholeheartedly followed the Lord your God. Now, as you can see, the Lord's kept me alive and well as he's promised for all these 45 years since Moses made his promise. And even while Israel wandered in the wilderness, today I'm 85 years old. I'm just as strong now as I was when Moses sent me on that journey. I can still travel and fight as well as I could then. So give me the hill country that the Lord promised me. You will remember that as scouts we found the descendants of Anak living there in a great walled towns. But if the Lord is with me, I will drive out of that land. I will drive them out of that land, just as the Lord said. The descendants of Anak were giants. And you may remember that when the scouts were sent out, 12 of them, when they came back with a report, it was only Joshua and Caleb that said, yes, we went in the land, and there was incredible fruit, incredible prosperity. The land is so fruitful. It's a beautiful place. 10 of the 12 said yes, but all we saw was giants. And so let me ask you a question. When you look at people in your organization, when you look at people in your team, when you look at other people, do you only see problems? Do you only see problems? One of the debates I've had for years about special needs kids, special needs children, they deal with issues in their life that they were born with. It's beyond their control. Kids that are high-functioning autistic or autistic children, kids that have severe ADHD, it seems like everybody has it now, but I mean those that really have it so that it's very difficult for them to sit still very long, for long durations, et cetera, et cetera. In our current educational system, with all due respect to teachers who I highly love and respect because they're on the frontline mission field every day. But it seems like our system, though, is set up only for a certain kind of personality. And you have any wild at heart boys in there, they don't stand a chance. In your church, if you're listening, if you're from a nonprofit or a church, most men want an usher. They want an usher. They want to get up during the service and walk around and do something. They don't want to sit in a chair for an hour or for 30, 40 minutes or whatever. They want to do something. They want to be active. When you have special needs kids, what happens is a lot of times the administration sees the child, instead of having problems, they see the child as the problem. And when you see somebody as the problem, then what do you want to do? Well, if I get rid of the kid, I'll get rid of my problem. And I sure don't want to have any more problems. So let me just get rid of this problem. And that's what happens all the time. Instead of seeing a child having problems, and all God's children got problems, we see the child as a problem. And I thought, that's not just for administrators in the educational process. That's for business leaders. That's for CEOs and CFOs and managers of companies. And it's true for us nonprofits and us churches. Do we see our people in the pew, sometimes people in the worship that come up with, a dozen complaints or something? Only that person's always stirring up issues. So do I see the person as maybe having some problems, or do I see the person as the problem? And can't they just find another church to go to? Can't that employee just find another place to work? Well, obviously, if they're destructive and they are emotionally violent towards other people, and they're totally trying to sabotage what's going on, yes, that's when you have to have a crucial conversation. But in general, does a person have some problems that maybe we need to sit down with and say, hey, how are things going at home? How are things going in your life? Help me to understand you a little bit better. And Joshua saw giants, but Joshua had faith. He didn't disassociate that he wasn't living in La La Land. He saw the giants, but he looked past the giants and he said, these grapes are so dadgum big, they're not going to believe this back home. We're going to have to take some of these grapes back home to show. Moses isn't going to believe how big these grapes are. These grapes are huge. So let's get, hey, Joshua, let's get a pole and let's take these grapes back, because Moses isn't going to believe it. And I tasted one of them. They're so sweet. So he didn't just see the problem with the giants. He saw the potential and the fruitfulness of the land. I love this about Caleb. Caleb was the first giant slayer. Because, folks, don't miss this. If there's a takeaway today, here it is. You don't take down a giant physically before you take down a giant mentally. Caleb started taking the giants down in his mind, in his heart, in his faith. Now later, David would take the giant down physically. But to give him benefit of the doubt, he had taken down a bear before, he'd taken down a lion before. I think in his mind, David believed he could take down the giant Goliath. So to give him his credit, that's true. But Caleb is the first giant slayer in the Bible. Caleb did not see the giants as a threat for him taking the land that God had for him and for the people of God. So what do you see when you look at problems in your life? What do you see when you look at relationship challenges and issues? Do you just see that as just a problem, you want to run away from it, or do you see potential? Do you see the possibility? Jesus said, when the Son of Man returns, are there people of faith? I think you and I need to ask God to help us to look at the situation and not just see the problems, but to see what lies behind the problems or beyond the problems. What is it that the enemy's trying to detour us? Why is the enemy trying to take us off path? Why is the enemy trying to pit us against each other? Is it that God's got great potential here in this situation in our organization or our team? And if we're pitted against each other, we won't get things accomplished. What if we can work through the problems and the challenges and then see the fruit and go after the fruit? I shared this last weekend, and I think it's such a PowerPoint, if you will, such an incredible principle. The war of your soul begins in your mind. The war of your soul begins in your mind. The enemy wants to attack your mind, wants to attack your thinking. The enemy wants you to think negative things about yourself. The enemy wants you, as our Plain Truth said last weekend, wants you to think about your mistakes, your problems, your issues. That's what the enemy wants to do. Wants you to focus on that. Because if the enemy can get you to do that, the enemy can detour you, side rail you. But the war that's going on in your soul and my soul begins in the mind. We've got to take our thoughts captive, and we've got to be careful because the mind is the filter for what goes in the heart. The mind is the filter for what goes in the heart. And we have to try to think. That's why Philippians talks about think upon these things, think upon pure things, noble things. And so it's important for us to think about God, to love God, and to try to love people. And when we see the situation, to not just see the problems, but to see the potential that lies beyond the problems and the benefits if we seek to do the right thing, if we seek to be faithful to the task in front of us. I hope that's true for you and me, and thank you for being a part of the podcast today. And may we be like Caleb, 85 years old, faithful, going the distance, got a sword in his hand, and says, let me loose, coach. Let me loose. Let me take the hill for you, God. I'll be faithful. May that be said of you.